Should you traditionally publish or self-publish? If you've ever stressed over this decision, look no further, because by the end of this video, you're going to know what's right for you and your book. I'm going to tell you the truth about both sides, and I'm going to lay out the pros and cons of each. Now, why should you listen to me? My name is Tim Grahl. I'm the CEO of StoryGrid, and I've been in the publishing industry for over 15 years. I've been a book marketing consultant for that long, and I've played lots of other roles in the publishing industry, and I've worked one-on-one with authors like Hugh Howey, the self-published New York Times bestselling author, and lots of other New York Times bestselling authors from traditional publishing. So over that time, I've seen the pros and cons of both self-publishing and traditional publishing, and I'm going to walk you through how to make the right decision for you. So I'm going to tell you the story of two different writers. The first one has always dreamed about being published by one of those major publishers, the ones with the big buildings in New York City, like Hachette or Penguin. And so finally, that writer has a manuscript that they're proud of, so they start looking for an agent. They get lots and lots of rejections, but eventually an agent is interested in their writing, but they want them to rewrite their book and change some things in it. So the writer does it, gives it to the agent shops it around in New York, and no bites. Nobody decides to publish the book. So the writer sets out to write another manuscript. And by the third manuscript, the agent's really excited about it. They take it and they go out and they get a publishing deal. And as a result, the writer gets about a $5,000 to $10,000 advance on that publishing deal. And that advance is usually paid out over at least a year in 2 to 3 different payments. So finally, the book is going to get published. The publisher puts a really nice cover on it, does a very light edit, and then tosses it up on Amazon and the other online distributors just to see how the book does. At this point, the book is not going to get any kind of physical distribution. That author's not going to be able to walk into a bookstore and see their book on that shelf. The other thing that happens or doesn't happen is any kind of marketing support from that publisher. The publisher is not going to be putting pretty much anything into a book that they've only given about a $5,000 to $10,000 advance to, and they're never going to give more than a $5,000 to $10,000 advance to a writer or author that is not tried and tested in the marketplace. And so the book comes out, and maybe the author sells 100, maybe 200 copies to like their friends and their family and coworkers and their Facebook followers, but then it falls off a cliff and never really sells after that. Now, at that point, the author is never going to get another publishing deal. Now, if they really bust their ass and work really hard and get their book to sell 5,000, maybe even 10,000 copies in the first 2 years that it's out, the publisher would probably pick up the next book, but probably get it about the same advance, maybe a little bit bigger, and you're back in that same treadmill. Now let's look at that second writer. This writer's done their research. They've read the blog posts, they've followed those successful indie authors, and they've found out that those publishers up in New York, they're a bunch of greedy bastards just trying to make money off the back of writers. So they decide they're going to self-publish. So now they have a manuscript that they want to put out in the world, but they need to get it edited. They want to make sure that it's good, but that costs some money, and the author doesn't have a ton of money to put into this, and they want to save it for the expenses coming down the road. So instead of hiring like a big time editor, they just hire like a friend's cousin who's an English major at a local university, and they get an edit done on the book. But now we have to put the book into production. So what does the author get to do next? That's right. They get to spend some more money. So they got to hire a copy editor, a line editor, and a proofreader to make sure that the book is good to go. And then we got to package the book. The most important thing is the cover. Most of the money that a writer that is self-publishing needs to spend is making sure it's a great cover. But again, money, because a really good cover by a top cover designer is going to cost you probably at least $5,000. Maybe you could get something for $3,000, but they don't really have that money. So they go on Fiverr or Upwork and they decide to just get the best that they can for $500 or $1,000 for that book. They put the cover on it, but now they've got to get the book formatted so they can actually sell it. So you got to have an interior designer design it so it can be printed. You have to have it converted into ebook. Even if you learn to do this yourself with software like Vellum, it's still hard to do and a pain to do, and it's easy to make a lot of mistakes. Then at that point, finally, after spending thousands of dollars, so the author finally gets the book up for sale, and bam, sales start rolling in, right? Well, You do the same thing. The author does the same thing, posts it on social media, sends it to his friends and family. He sells a couple hundred copies, but doesn't really ever make much money on it. And then when he actually does any kind of accounting on it, he realizes he lost money. He lost thousands of dollars. At least that author that got traditionally published got $5,000 or $10,000 over a year. I tell you these two stories because I've seen them played out over and over and over, both of them for traditional publishing and self-publishing. And so if you have a book that you want to get out into the world, you've got to make the right decision for you and your book. And that is what I'm going to walk you through to avoid some of those traps that I just mentioned in those two stories. So let's look at the pros and cons of each, and let's start with self-publishing. What are the pros of self-publishing? Well, first of all, you get to keep complete control over your book. You can do whatever you want. You can write whatever you want. You can edit however you want. You can pick whatever cover design you want. You can do whatever you want because you have complete control over your project. If you get a traditional publisher, you're not going to have final say on all that stuff. So you get to keep all of that when you self-publish. You also get to keep a much higher percentage of the royalties. So on Amazon.com, you pretty much make about 70% off of ebooks, and you make more like 15 to 25% of royalties when you're with a traditional publisher. And so you get to keep a much higher percentage of the money that comes in off your book. The third pro of self-publishing is complete freedom with marketing and pricing of your book. Now, this could be just kind of lumped under the control of the entire project, but I separate it out because this is really important. If you want to give away a bunch of copies of your book and you're self-published, you can do that. If you want to do that and you're traditionally published, 99% chance your publisher is going to tell you no. A lot of times they give you less than 10 copies that you can actually give away to promote the book. And if you want any other copies, you got to buy those yourself. If you want to run price specials on your book, you can just do that. With a traditional publisher, you have to ask for permission, and a lot of times it takes a long time to get the permission if you ever get it. In fact, a traditionally published friend of mine, it took him 2 full years to convince his publisher and give him permission to run a price promotion that he wanted to run on his own book. And so by self-publishing, you take away all the bureaucracy about making decisions about marketing and pricing of your book. Okay, so now let's look at the cons of self-publishing. There are some cons for this. The first one is you have complete control over your project. So that's a pro, but it's also a con. That means you have to make all of the decisions. A lot of people talk about self-publishing a book, if you're trying to actually do it right, is like starting a small business. You have to hire all of these contractors, you've got to get them all working together, and you've got to pay all those bills yourself. So you get complete control over the project, that's the pro, but you also now have complete control over the project, which can be a huge con. Another con of self-publishing is just having no infrastructure around your book. So traditional publishing, these people have been doing this stuff a long time. They know how to do this stuff. They know how to make good decisions around this. There's lots of horror stories, of course, and I could come up with a whole list of my own, but there still is infrastructure there. People know what they're doing. They've been doing it for a really long time. And you don't get that if you self-publish. You don't get that institutional knowledge, which leads me to con number 3, which means you're going to make mistakes. When I was publishing my very first book, Your First 1,000 Copies, we were getting really close to the point where I was actually going to publish it. And I put the book, one of the proof copies, on the shelf, and then I was looking at it, and I was on a phone call just kind of staring at it, and I realized we put the text on the spine the wrong direction. Now, how did this happen? Well, I had never published a book before, and neither had the person I had designing the book, because I had an in-house designer for my company at the time. And as a result, we almost made that mistake, and we made lots of other mistakes. And so you're going to make mistakes when you've never published a book before, because you're going to have to learn this process as you go. So mistakes are definitely going to happen. It's probably going to set back the actual pub date of the book. And the final con here, I almost hesitated to put in here, but I do think it's worth saying, is you don't get an advance when you self-publish your book. Now, the reason I hesitate to say that is most authors, the vast majority of authors, do not get any kind of life-changing amount of money as an advance. $5,000 or $10,000 paid out over 12 or 18 months usually means maybe an extra vacation, but that's pretty much it. The other thing to mention here is that's an advance against royalties, which means you never actually make royalties off your book until that advance is paid out. And as I mentioned earlier, your royalties on individual sales is much lower than when you self-publish. But it is a con. You don't get any kind of advance money when you're self-publishing. You have to put the money in and hope that you get the money out when the book is actually out and selling in the marketplace. So that is self-publishing. That's the pros and cons of self-publishing. Let's look at the pros and cons for traditional publishing. The first pro of traditional publishing I've already mentioned as a con in self-publishing, which is the infrastructure of having professionals that do this every single day working with you on your book. Again, there's lots of horror stories. You're not going to get a lot of their time when your book is going through their system, but you do have people that are working on your book that do this every single day. So that's the first pro, is the overall institutional infrastructure of traditional publishing. The second pro is the community around traditional publishing. Now, this doesn't happen all of the time, but have you ever wondered why this brand new author coming out with their first book gets these blurbs from like best-selling authors across the cover and on the back cover of their book? How do they get these blurbs from big-name authors when they're a first-time author nobody's ever heard of? It's because of the community around traditional publishing. Their agent probably has a relationship with the agent or editor for the author, or that author is published in the same traditional publishing house as the first-time author, and so getting their book on that author's desk is way easier because they're in that community. So having that community around traditional publishing is a big pro. Again, it doesn't always work for you. It doesn't always mean something's going to happen, but there's a possibility there. Where if you're self-publishing your very first book and you're not famous independently, the odds of getting any kind of big name author to blurb your book is really, really small. So now let's look at the cons of traditional publishing. The first con is something we've already mentioned, which is you give up control. You won't have the final say on cover design, on the interior of your book, on really anything. The publisher has the final say, and you have turned over rights to this book. So while you own the copyright, they own the license rights to sell that book worldwide in every single format. So you can't just give away as many copies of the book as you can. You can't sell it on your own. You give up all of that control around your book, which then leads me back to the next con, which is marketing and pricing. So I kind of hit on this earlier around self-publishing, but I really want to just double click on this. You will have to do all the marketing yourself. You are not going to get any real support from your traditional publisher to do the marketing, but they will put some handcuffs on you on what you are allowed to do. So you can't give away lots of copies of your book, even though we know that actually drives sales. You're not even going to be able to give away large chunks of your book. Like you couldn't give away half your book to get somebody interested in reading the entire thing. You don't have pricing control. They're going to price the book at whatever they want to price it, and getting them to adjust that or run any kind of deal promotions is really, really hard. So not only is the marketing still up to you when you're traditionally published, they're going to put some handcuffs on you that limit what you can do around your book. And that is definitely a con. And the final con is the money. You're only going to make somewhere between 15 and 25% of royalties, depending on where your book's sold, what format it is, what edition it is, all of that kind of stuff. But basically 15 to 25% of royalties are going to come into your pocket, which is way less than when you do it on your own and you self-publish. So if you think that your book is going to sell a bunch of copies, it's not always in the best interest to hand over all of that money to a traditional publisher just because you get it in advance. So you've got to pay attention to the money here too. The money is a negative because you don't get those long-term royalties at the higher rate that you can when you self-publish. Okay, so how do you actually make this decision? So we've talked about basically the worst case scenario, which is pretty common in both traditional and self-publishing. And then I walked you through the pros and cons of both. But how do you actually make this decision? Well, it's a 3-step process. And actually, we're going to start with step 0. So maybe it's a 4-step process. Step 0 is don't make an emotional decision. Look, I've loved to read since I was a little kid. I dreamed of being able to walk into a bookstore and see my book on the shelf, cover out, of course, maybe even on one of those front tables. I dreamed of becoming a New York Times best-selling author, and both of those things are pretty much only going to happen or even have a chance of happening if you traditionally publish. But yet I have to make a decision that's right for me. So those emotional decisions around getting picked or the gatekeepers, like I want you to ask why you want to be traditionally published so badly. Is it because it's the right decision for your book, or is it because you want somebody to tell you that you're special? So no matter what you do and how you make the decision, I want you to make the right decision for you from a logical place instead of from an emotional decision because of some kind of feeling you've had since you were a kid, if you're like me at all. Okay, step one, start by assuming you're going to self-publish. Now again, not because I love self-publishing and I think everybody should self-publish and traditional publishing sucks. I have lots of friends that traditionally publish. They're happy with it and I can make a really strong argument why they should go with it. But here's the thing I want you to remember. You have created something that has value. Too many writers forget this in the process. You've worked really hard to get to where you're at. You're putting a book out into the world. There's value on that, and you need to treat it as if it is a valuable thing. So I own a 2016 Toyota Prius. Now, I know it's not the fanciest of cars, but it does get good gas mileage, and it's worth something. If I decide that I want to get rid of the Prius, I'm not going to just start walking down the street begging anybody I can find to take the Prius, and whatever they offer me, I'll just take. If they're like, here's $300, I'm like, oh, thank God, I'll take your $300. Take my car off my hands. No, the Prius has a worth, it has a value, and unless I get something of equal value, I'm not going to hand over my Prius. And yet, so many writers, I see them treating their writing like the guy walking around the street. They just go around begging any agent, begging any editor, please take this book. I'll take anything, a $3,000 advance. That's fine. I'll sign away all my rights. That's fine. I just want you to pick me. Just pick my book. I want you to recognize the value of the thing you've created. And if you're going to give up the rights to your book, you need to get something in return. So when you self-publish, you keep the rights to the book. You own all the rights of the book. When you traditionally publish, you give up the right to sell that work worldwide. So if you're going to give that to somebody, they better give you something of value in return, and you've got to make sure that it's of equal or more value than the thing you're giving them. So that's why step one is start with self-publishing, mainly to start with owning the rights yourself, and you're not going to give those up unless you get something of value in return. Step number two is to assess your values. And I've got 4 questions for you that I want you to use as you assess your values. The first is, how important is speed to you? How fast do you want to get your book out into the marketplace? Because if you sign your publishing contract today, say you already have an agent, he's already shopping it around, you get an offer and you sign it today, it's a minimum of 12 months before your book comes out. You're probably looking at something closer to 18 months. And so if you haven't even started any of this process, you're probably at least 2 to 3 years away from your book actually coming out. Or of course, if you self-publish, you can come out with it really quickly. So if moving quickly is important to you, you're going to want to go with self-publishing. If it's not so important to you, maybe traditional publishing is worth doing. But let's look at the second thing. How important is ownership and control of your book? If you self-publish, you retain ownership of everything. You get to own everything at the end of the day and do whatever you want. If you sign with a traditional publisher, as I mentioned, they make final decisions on everything. You don't really own the book at the end of the process, but this may or may not be important to you which way to go. Now, I want to be clear here. There are horror stories on both sides of the fence. People that love self-publishing talk about the horror stories on traditional publishing, and traditional publishing talk about the horror stories on self-publishing, and they're both true. So you're not somehow mitigating risk by doing one over the other. But if being in complete control of your project is important to you, you need to self-publish because you are giving up that control when you sign a traditional publishing deal. So you've got to think about how important it is to have control of your book, both short-term and long-term. Question number 3, how much money do you have to spend? Now, technically, you can self-publish for $0. You can literally upload a Google document to KDP to get it on sale on Amazon and self-publish your book. But if you want to make something as high quality as traditional publishing, you're looking at probably a minimum investment of $5,000 to have the cover done, to have the book designed interior, to have it converted to all the different formats, and to make sure that you get it edited well with the line editing and copy editing and proofreading and all of that. Probably absolute minimum $5,000. To do it to the point where people would look at it and see it as just as good as any traditional publishing book, you're looking at probably $10,000 to $20,000. I have friends that have literally spent 6 figures self-publishing their book. And so you have to think about how much money you have to invest in this book in order to get it out in the world. So a lot of times you're kind of looking at money versus time, right? So you might be 2.5, 3 years or more from getting traditionally published. But if you have no money to invest in your book, that's kind of the only way, the only chance you have. And so you have to think about, that's the third question, is how much money do you have to invest in this project? The fourth question that goes to values is, how important is validation from the industry to you? Now, if we knew each other, if we were having a cup of coffee, I would tell you all the stories of my friends that got traditional publishing deals. The book came out and it wasn't that big of a deal. Even my friends that walked into a bookstore and they saw their book on the bookshelf. It's like, well, once you do it once, it's kind of like not a big deal. And so I would try to talk you out of wanting that validation from the traditional publishing industry. They are not magical people that work there. They're just normal people that happen to work at these institutions that have been around for a long time. But I do know, I've met writers, it is really important to them that they get that Penguin logo, they get that Hachette logo, they get that little brown logo on the side of their book, and they are seen in the traditional publishing world as relevant. If that's important to you, obviously, I'm not going to try to talk you out of it. Go for it. See if it can happen to you. If that's your dream, then go for it. But just make sure you really thought through all of the implications of that decision. So that's the fourth question, is how important is validation from the publishing industry to you? Step 0 was to not make an emotional decision, but step 1 was to start with self-publishing. So you retain the ownership of the valuable asset you've created. Step 2 was to assess your values, and I gave you 4 questions to assess those values. And now step 3, make a decision and commit. Decide what you're going to do and go after it for at least a year. A lot of problems I see at this point is authors waffling. Well, should I self-publish? Or, I'm kind of trying to get an agent, but if that doesn't work, then I'll just self-publish. And like what happens is, because they're getting pulled in 2 different directions, they make no progress at all. So whatever you decide to do, commit and go after it with 100% certainty that you're going to have success. That's the only way it's going to happen, because here's the thing, both roads are hard. There is not an easy way to put your book out into the world. Traditional publishing and self-publishing both have their pitfalls, or both have long roads ahead of them to make them successful. Now, if you're struggling with this decision, I'm going to give you a couple things to think about. First of all, this is not the most important decision in your life or your career. Whatever decision you go after, if it doesn't work, it doesn't mean your entire hopes of ever being a writer are tanked for the rest of your life. If you try to get a publishing deal and it doesn't work out, you can self-publish. You can also self-publish and later try to go get a traditional publishing deal. And I know people are going to put in the comments the pitfalls in that, and I agree with all of those, but I've seen people do it both ways. And so it's absolutely possible. So try to reduce the amount of pressure that you're putting on, especially this particular book. Do what you think is right in the moment, go after it, but this is not the most important decision. This is not setting you up for failure or success for the rest of your life. The second thing that I've already mentioned is there are winners and there are losers on both sides of the fence. There are horror stories from self-publishing and from traditional publishing. So if you think by picking one, you're somehow mitigating the risk, that's not how it works. There's risk on both sides of it, and you just have to accept that. So when you're making this decision, don't try to make some perfect decision that ensures your success. That doesn't exist. Just pick the one that's right for you after assessing your values and go after it. And then finally, just so you know, either way you go, traditional or self-publishing, the success is 100% on you. You're not going to get marketing and promotion support from a traditional publisher or from self-publishing. Obviously, you have to do it yourself, self-publishing. So you've got to figure out the marketing part. Now, I've got some more videos to help you on that on this channel. I'll link to them down below. One of them will pop up on your screen shortly. But this is the thing I want you to remember, is that whether you get traditionally published or self-published, it's your job when the book comes out to make it successful. So you've got to set out to do that either way. So it's not like you're going to get some sort of support from a traditional publisher. That means you can kind of just sit back and watch the sales roll in. Now, to wrap this up, I'm going to tell you a little story about a guy named John Scalzi. He was a self-published author that was having a lot of success. He was putting out his books. He was selling 6 figures worth of copies. People loved him. People loved his books. And other writers looked up to him. Other self-published authors that wanted to be self-published, they looked up to him as this beacon of success. And then John did the unthinkable thing. he signed a traditional publishing deal. And not just any deal. He signed a 10-year, 13-book, $3.4 million deal. Now, at first, that seems staggering. Like, those kind of numbers seems like, get naked and run in the streets shooting off fireworks kind of money, until you do a little bit of back-of-the-napkin math on what John was already selling of his books. And once you actually do the math and look at what he was already selling and what this traditional publisher was offering him, it seems like a stupid deal. Like, he would have easily made twice as much or 3 times as much continuing to self-publish his books. So why would John, this already successful self-publishing author, sign a 10-year, 13-book, $3.4 million deal? Well, I'll let him tell you in his own words. He put this on his blog at the time. It's about stability, basically. Also, I'm not going to lie. For the next decade, I know where my money's coming from. For a writer, that's some nifty job security, especially with a daughter coming up on college. Not having to search for a new book deal every book or 2 means I can spend more time writing, which I think is the thing we would all like me to be doing. And then he said this, look, I like to write. I don't mind the marketing stuff, but there's a whole lot more that goes into producing a book than just showing up with a manuscript and then telling people about it. I don't want to do any of the rest of that stuff. That's why publishers exist. That's what publishers do. As it happens, when it comes to science fiction, Tor, my traditional publisher, is as good as it gets in every department. They are better at these things I don't want to do than I am. I am delighted to partner with them and let them handle all that. I am clearly making enough money. We all have different values and goals as writers and authors, and yours may be different than John's, or maybe yours is exactly the same than John's. Every writer should be assessing this pros and cons of what's best for them. So for you, figure out what's important to you, what are your values, and figure out the right publishing venture for you, and then take that step. Go as hard as you can to get that thing that you want, because ultimately, this decision is not going to break or make your writing career. That is going to be into your hands, and that's a long-term game, not a one-time decision game. So keep writing and keep putting your work out into the world. Now, one of the things we believe at StoryGrid about this whole thing is that the better the book is written, the more likely it is to find an audience and keep selling for a long period of time. We have a lot of data to back that up. And so that's what we're dedicated to, is helping you build the skills, write a book, and leave a legacy. And if you want to join us for that, I recommend you check out our next workshop. You can go to storygrid.com/workshop. This 6-week scene writing workshop has changed hundreds of writers' lives. It's one of my favorite things to do here at StoryGrid, and I hope you join us for the next one. So go to storygrid.com/workshop. But either way, thanks for being a writer. Thanks for being a part of our community here at StoryGrid, and I'll see you next time.